Never thought his Tuesday morning would turn into a nightmare that would change his life forever. He was sitting at his kitchen table, drinking coffee and reading the news on his tablet when the first sound hit him like a thunderbolt. The front door exploded inward with such force that the wooden frame splintered and scattered across his living room floor. "Police, get down now." The voices were deafening, echoing through his modest two-bedroom home like cannons firing in a small cave. Dropped his coffee mug, watching in slow motion as it shattered against the tile floor, the brown liquid spreading in all directions. His wife Sarah was upstairs getting ready for work. He could hear her shower running just moments before. Now he heard her screaming, a sound that cut through his heart like a knife. Tried to stand up, his legs shaking, but before he could take a single step, 3 massive figures in black tactical gear surrounded him. "Hands behind your head, do not move." The officer closest to him had his weapon drawn, pointing it directly at his chest. The red laser dot danced across his white t-shirt as his hands trembled while reaching behind his head. His mind was racing, trying to understand what was happening. Why were they here? What had he done wrong? The sound of heavy boots thundered through his house as more officers poured through the broken doorway. Counted at least 8 men, all dressed in full combat gear, their faces hidden behind dark masks and protective glasses. They moved through his home like a well-oiled machine, checking every corner, every closet, every possible hiding spot. "Clear," one officer shouted from the kitchen. "Clear," came another voice from the living room. Realized they were searching his entire house, treating it like some kind of dangerous crime scene. But this was just his home, the place where he and Sarah had lived peacefully for the past 3 years. They had never even gotten a parking ticket, let alone done anything that would warrant this kind of response. Sarah's screams were getting louder now and could hear the panic in her voice. She was calling his name, begging to know what was happening. The shower had stopped running, which meant they had reached her. The thought of these armed strangers confronting his wife while she was vulnerable and defenseless made his blood boil, but the weapons pointed at him kept him frozen in place. "We have the female," shouted an officer from upstairs. Hart stopped. The way the man said the female made Sarah sound like some kind of criminal suspect instead of an innocent woman who worked as a kindergarten teacher and volunteered at the local animal shelter every weekend. "Bring her down," commanded the officer who seemed to be in charge. He was taller than the others, with sergeant stripes visible on his tactical vest. Noticed the man's eyes were cold and calculating, showing no emotion despite the chaos they had just created in his home. The sound of Sarah being brought downstairs was torture for. He could hear her crying, asking questions that nobody was answering. "Why are you doing this? What's going on? Are you okay?" Her voice was shaking with fear and confusion. When she finally appeared at the bottom of the stairs, felt his world crumble. Sarah was wearing her bathrobe, her hair still wet from the shower. Her hands were secured behind her back with plastic zip ties, and an officer was firmly gripping her arm as he guided her into the living room. Her eyes were red from crying, and when she saw on his knees with his hands behind his head, she let out a sob that broke his heart into a million pieces. "Please," said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can you tell us what this is about? We haven't done anything wrong." The sergeant stepped forward, pulling out a folded piece of paper from his vest pocket. "We have a warrant to search this property for illegal firearms and drug manufacturing equipment. We have reliable information that this address is being used for criminal activity." Felt like he had been punched in the stomach. Illegal firearms? Drug manufacturing? These accusations were completely insane. He had never owned a gun in his life, and the strongest drug in his house was probably Sarah's allergy medication. Someone had made a terrible mistake, but looking at the serious faces around him, realized that explaining this wasn't going to be easy. "There must be some mistake," Sarah said through her tears. "We're teachers, works at the high school, and I teach kindergarten. We don't have any guns or drugs. Please, you have the wrong house." The sergeant's expression didn't change. "That's what we're here to determine. The search will proceed as planned." He nodded to his team, and they immediately spread out through the house again, this time with a different purpose. Could hear them moving furniture, opening drawers, and going through their personal belongings. The sound of his life being turned upside down echoed through every room. One officer was taking photographs of everything, the bright flash of his camera creating strange shadows on the walls. Another was making notes on a clipboard, documenting every detail of what they found. Noticed they were being very thorough, which meant this search was going to take hours. "Can we see the warrant?" asked, trying to keep his voice steady and respectful. He remembered from television shows that they had the right to see the warrant, to understand exactly what the police were looking for and why they were there. The sergeant handed him the paper, but kept hold of one corner so couldn't take it. The official document was filled with legal language that was difficult to understand, but could make out his address and several phrases that made his blood run cold. Suspected drug manufacturing operation. Illegal weapons storage. Armed and dangerous suspects. Armed and dangerous. Had never hurt anyone in his entire life. The most violent thing he had ever done was kill a spider in the bathroom, and even then he felt bad about it. Sarah was the same way. She cried when they watched sad movies and rescued injured birds she found in their backyard. The idea that anyone could think they were dangerous criminals was absolutely ridiculous. "This is crazy," Sarah whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "This can't be happening." But it was happening, and it was about to get much worse. 20 minutes into the search, watched helplessly as the officers tore apart everything he and Sarah had built together. Their wedding photos were scattered across the floor, the glass from broken frames creating a dangerous carpet of sharp pieces. The bookshelf Sarah had carefully organized was now empty, with hundreds of books piled in messy stacks as officers checked behind each one for hidden compartments. "Found something?" shouted an officer from the garage. Felt his stomach drop as everyone's attention turned toward the voice. The sergeant immediately moved toward the garage, speaking into his radio with words couldn't quite hear. Sarah looked at with wide, frightened eyes, both of them knowing that whatever had been found would only make their situation worse. The officer emerged from the garage carrying a small wooden box that recognized immediately. It was Sarah's jewelry box, an antique piece she had inherited from her grandmother. Inside were her wedding ring, some earrings her mother had given her, and a few other pieces of sentimental jewelry. Nothing valuable enough to steal, but everything precious to Sarah's heart. "What's in the box?" the sergeant demanded, as if he had discovered a container of explosives instead of a simple jewelry collection. "It's just my jewelry," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely audible. "My grandmother's jewelry box. There's nothing illegal in there." The officer opened the box roughly, dumping the contents onto the coffee table. Sarah's wedding ring bounced and rolled across the surface, coming to rest near a pile of their scattered mail. Watched his wife's face crumple as her precious memories were treated like evidence in a crime scene. The officer picked up each piece with gloved hands, examining them carefully as if they might be hiding drugs or tiny weapons. "These look expensive," the officer commented, holding up a pair of diamond earrings that Sarah's father had given her for her college graduation. "Where did you get the money for jewelry like this?" "My father gave them to me," Sarah replied, her voice growing stronger despite her fear. "I can show you the receipt. I still have it in my filing cabinet upstairs. He bought them at K Jewelers 6 years ago." The sergeant made a note on his clipboard, but his expression suggested he didn't believe her story. Realized that these officers had already made up their minds about who they were and what they had done wrong. Every innocent explanation they gave was being treated with suspicion, as if they were clever criminals trying to hide their guilt with well-rehearsed lies. "We need to search both of you for weapons," the sergeant announced. "Standard procedure during a warrant execution." Felt his face burn with embarrassment and anger. Being searched like a criminal in his own home was humiliating enough, but the thought of these strangers putting their hands on Sarah made him furious. She was still wearing only her bathrobe, still traumatized from being dragged out of her shower by armed men who had invaded their home without warning. "Can a female officer search my wife?" asked, trying to maintain some dignity in an impossible situation. "She's not dressed properly and she hasn't done anything wrong." "We don't have a female officer available," the sergeant replied coldly. "She can be searched here, or we can take her to the station and search her there." Sarah closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "Just do it here," she whispered. "I want to stay with." Had to turn away as the officer began the search. The sound of Sarah's quiet crying mixed with the voices of the other officers continuing their destruction of his home. Every second felt like an hour, every minute like a day. This was supposed to be a normal Tuesday morning. Sarah should be teaching her kindergarten class right now, reading stories to 5-year-olds and helping them learn their letters. Instead, she was being treated like a dangerous criminal by people who were supposed to protect and serve. When the search was finished, the officer stepped back without a word. No weapons, no drugs, no evidence of any criminal activity. turned back to look at Sarah, who was clutching her bathrobe tightly around herself, her face red with humiliation and anger. "Now you," the sergeant said to. The search was thorough and professional, but it felt like a violation of everything believed about his rights as an American citizen. He had always trusted the police, always believed they were the good guys who protected people like him and Sarah from real criminals. Now he was beginning to understand how quickly that trust could be shattered when you found yourself on the wrong side of their suspicion. "Nothing," the officer reported after finishing his search. The sergeant made another note on his clipboard, but his expression didn't change. Was beginning to realize that finding no evidence wasn't going to end this nightmare. These officers had come here expecting to find something specific, and they weren't going to leave until they found it, whether it actually existed or not. "Let's check the basement again," the sergeant ordered, "and tear up those floorboards in the kitchen. Sometimes these operations hide their equipment under the flooring." Watched in horror as two officers headed toward his kitchen with crowbars and hammers. Those floorboards were original hardwood from 1952, carefully restored by the previous owner, and one of the main reasons Sarah had bought this house. The thought of watching them destroyed for no reason made him sick to his stomach. "Wait," called out, his voice louder than he intended. "You can't destroy our house without finding something first. Don't we have any rights here?" The sergeant turned to face him, and for the first time saw a hint of irritation in the man's eyes. "You have the right to remain silent," the sergeant said slowly, emphasizing each word. "You might want to use it." The threat was clear, and forced himself to stay quiet as the sounds of destruction continued from his kitchen. Each blow of the hammer against his beautiful floors felt like a punch to his chest. Sarah was crying again, not just from fear now, but from heartbreak at watching their home being systematically destroyed by people who were supposed to be protecting them. "Found something else," came a shout from upstairs. This time it was Sarah who looked like she might collapse. Tried to catch her eye to give her some kind of reassurance, but he had no comfort to offer. They were trapped in a nightmare that seemed to have no end, and every discovery the officers made would only dig them deeper into trouble they didn't deserve. The officer who had shouted from upstairs came down carrying Sarah's laptop computer and a small plastic bag containing what looked like white powder. Felt his world spinning out of control as he recognized the bag. It was baking soda that Sarah used for cleaning, stored in a simple sandwich bag because the original box had torn open in their pantry last week. "Well, well, well," the sergeant said with a satisfied smile. "Looks like we found your stash after all." "That's baking soda," Sarah exclaimed, her voice rising with panic and frustration. "I use it to clean the bathroom. You can test it right now and see for yourself." The sergeant held up the bag, examining the white powder through the plastic. "That's what they all say. We'll have it tested at the lab, and then we'll see what story you want to tell." Couldn't believe what he was hearing. Any basic field test would immediately prove that the powder was ordinary baking soda, not some illegal drug. But the way the sergeant was acting suggested that he wasn't interested in quick tests or easy explanations. He seemed determined to find them guilty of something, anything, to justify the destruction he had already caused. "And this computer," the officer continued, holding up Sarah's laptop, "probably contains evidence of your drug distribution network. Customer lists, transaction records, communication with suppliers." Sarah let out a bitter laugh despite her tears. "That computer has my lesson plans on it. I teach kindergarten. The only network on there is my account where I save craft ideas for my students." The sergeant wasn't listening anymore. He was speaking into his radio, using codes and numbers that didn't understand. But he caught enough words to realize that they were calling for additional units, possibly a drug detection dog, and requesting backup for what they now considered an active drug bust. "This is insane," said, his voice growing stronger as his shock began to transform into anger. "You people have lost your minds. We're school teachers, not drug dealers. Our biggest crime is probably returning library books late." "Save it for your lawyer," the sergeant replied. "You're both under arrest for possession of illegal substances and suspicion of drug distribution." As the words hit him, felt something snap inside his chest. Under arrest. They were actually going to arrest him and Sarah for baking soda and accounts. Two innocent people were about to be dragged to jail because a group of overzealous officers couldn't admit they had made a mistake. Sarah was sobbing now, great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. The sight of his wife falling apart while being handcuffed in their destroyed living room filled with a rage he had never experienced before. These people had invaded their home, terrorized his wife, destroyed their belongings, and now they were going to arrest them for crimes they had never committed. "You have the right to remain silent." The officer began reading Sarah her Miranda rights while securing plastic restraints around her wrists. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Watched the scene unfolding before him and felt completely powerless. The justice system he had always believed in was failing them in the most spectacular way possible. They were about to become statistics, just two more people swallowed up by a system that was more interested in making arrests than finding the truth. "Wait," said his voice cutting through the chaos. "I need to make a phone call." "You can make your phone call from the station," the sergeant replied without looking up from his paperwork. "No," said his voice growing firmer. "I need to make a phone call right now. It's important." The sergeant finally looked at him with annoyed curiosity. "Important how?" Took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to say would either save them or make everything infinitely worse. He had been holding on to this information for months, hoping he would never have to use it, but watching his wife being arrested for baking soda had forced his hand. "Because I work for the FBI." The words hung in the air like a bomb that hadn't exploded yet. Every officer in the room stopped what they were doing and turned to stare at. The sergeant's expression changed from annoyed confidence to confused uncertainty in the span of a single heartbeat. "What did you say?" the sergeant asked slowly. "I said I work for the FBI," repeated, his voice steady now that he had committed to this course of action. "I'm an undercover agent working on a federal investigation. My handler's name is Special Agent Jennifer, and her direct number is in my phone." Sarah stopped crying and stared at her husband with wide, shocked eyes. In 3 years of marriage, had never mentioned working for the FBI. As far as she knew, he was a high school history teacher who graded papers and coached the debate team. The revelation that her husband was apparently living a double life was almost as shocking as everything else that had happened that morning. The sergeant's face had gone pale. If was telling the truth, then this entire operation had just turned into a federal incident that could destroy careers and trigger investigations at the highest levels. If was lying, then he had just made his situation infinitely worse by impersonating a federal agent. "Prove it," the sergeant demanded. Nodded toward the kitchen counter where his phone was still sitting next to his scattered breakfast. "My phone, speed dial 7. Ask for Special Agent and tell her that agent needs immediate extraction from a blown operation." The sergeant hesitated, clearly weighing his options. If he ignored claim and it turned out to be true, his career would be over. If he followed up on the claim and it turned out to be false, he would look like a fool who fell for a desperate lie. Either way, his comfortable certainty about this arrest had just evaporated. "Get his phone," the sergeant ordered one of his officers. As the officer moved toward the kitchen, looked at Sarah, and saw the hurt and confusion in her eyes. He had kept his real job secret from her for 3 years, lying to her every day about who he really was and what he really did. Even if they got out of this mess, he wasn't sure his marriage would survive the revelation. But right now, saving Sarah from jail was more important than saving his marriage. Everything else they could work out later. The officer handed his phone to the sergeant, who stared at the device as if it might explode in his hands. The room had gone completely silent except for the sound of Sarah's quiet sniffling and the distant noise of officers still searching the upper floors of the house. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see if his desperate claim would prove to be their salvation or his final downfall. The sergeant scrolled through his phone contacts until he found the entry marked Agent 7. His finger hovered over the call button for several long seconds before he finally pressed it. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, and felt his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone in the room could hear it. Came a crisp, professional voice from the phone's speaker. "This is Sergeant Mike with the Metro Police SWAT team," the sergeant said, his voice carefully controlled. "I have someone here claiming to be agent who says you're his handler." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, followed by a string of words that made every officer in the room flinch. "What the hell is going on? Why is calling me from a police operation? His cover was supposed to be ironclad." The sergeant's face went from pale to ashen gray. Ma'am, we executed a warrant on his residence based on an anonymous tip about drug manufacturing. We found white powder and arrested both him and his wife. You arrested Sarah? Agent's voice rose to what could only be described as barely controlled fury. Do you have any idea what you've just done? Has been working undercover for 18 months on a federal drug trafficking case. His teaching job was his cover. His marriage was his cover. And you just blew the entire operation because someone called in a bogus tip. Closed his eyes and let out a long breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Around him, he could see the officers beginning to understand the magnitude of their mistake. Sarah was staring at him with a mixture of relief, anger, and complete bewilderment. Ma'am, the sergeant stammered, we had reliable intelligence that this address was being used for drug manufacturing. We followed proper procedure. Reliable intelligence? Agent's laugh was cold and bitter. Someone played you, Sergeant. This was either a test of cover or an attempt by the drug organization to expose him. Either way, you just handed them exactly what they wanted. Every drug dealer in the city is about to find out that the high school history teacher who's been asking questions about their operation is actually a federal agent. The implications of Agent's words hit everyone in the room like a physical blow. If cover had been blown, then not only was their federal investigation ruined, but's life was now in serious danger. Drug organizations didn't take kindly to undercover agents, and they had long memories when it came to settling scores. What do you need us to do? The sergeant asked, all of his earlier confidence completely gone. First, you're going to both of them right now, Agent commanded. Then you're going to get every single one of your officers out of that house immediately. Then you're going to forget this address exists and forget you ever heard the name. The sergeant nodded to his officers, who quickly moved to remove the restraints from both and Sarah. Sarah rubbed her wrists where the plastic cuffs had left red marks, still looking at her husband as if she had never seen him before in her life. Second, Agent continued, you're going to make sure that absolutely no record of this operation appears in any police database. No incident reports, no arrest records, no search warrant documentation. This entire morning never happened, do you understand? Yes, ma'am, the sergeant replied quickly. What about the warrant? We still have the paperwork. Bring it to FBI headquarters within the hour. And bring the original anonymous tip that triggered this whole mess. We need to trace the source and figure out who compromised its operation. Finally spoke up. Agent, what happens now? Is the operation blown? We'll have to assume it is, Agent replied, her voice gentler now that she was talking to him instead of the police officers. We're going to have to extract you immediately and relocate both you and Sarah until we can assess the threat level. Pack whatever you absolutely need. You have 30 minutes before our security team arrives. Sarah finally found her voice. Relocate? What does that mean? Are we going into witness protection? Hopefully just temporary relocation until we can determine if your identities have been compromised, Agent explained. I'm sorry, Mrs. I know this is a shock. We'll explain everything once you're in a secure location. The phone call ended, and the sergeant immediately began barking orders to his team. Within minutes, the house that had been filled with armed officers and the sounds of systematic destruction became eerily quiet. The SWAT team packed up their equipment and filed out through the same doorway they had smashed open less than 2 hours earlier. And Sarah stood in the wreckage of their living room, finally alone for the first time since the nightmare began. Broken picture frames, scattered books, torn furniture cushions, and pieces of their destroyed kitchen floor surrounded them like the aftermath of a tornado. Sarah turned to face her husband and could see years of questions in her eyes. Who are you? She asked quietly. I thought I was married to high school history teacher, but apparently I don't know you at all. Reached out to touch her face, but she stepped back, shaking her head. Sarah, I wanted to tell you so many times, but the Bureau insisted that my cover had to be complete. Nobody could know, not even you. Especially not you because you're such a terrible liar. If you had known I was FBI, it would have shown on your face every time someone mentioned my work. So our entire marriage has been a lie? Sarah's voice was getting stronger, but could hear the hurt underneath the anger. Everything you told me about yourself, about your past, about your job, all of it was fake. No, said firmly. My feelings for you are real, my love for you is real. The man you fell in love with, the man who proposed to you, the man who married you, that's really me. The only thing that was fake was the job. Everything else was true. Sarah looked around at their destroyed home, then back at her husband, who was apparently a federal agent she had never known. "I need time to think," she said finally. "I need time to figure out what's real and what isn't." Before could respond, they heard the sound of cars pulling into their driveway. Through the broken doorway, could see black SUVs with government license plates. Agent security team had arrived to take them away from the only life they had known together. "We'll figure this out," promised as the FBI agents approached their house. "Whatever happens, we'll figure it out together." But as they gathered their essential belongings and prepared to leave everything else behind, wasn't sure if Sarah believed him anymore. The 5 words that had stopped the SWAT team and saved them from jail had also revealed a secret that might destroy their marriage forever. Sometimes the truth was more dangerous than any lie.